Hello, my name is Yves Sandfort. Today with me in the comdivision office is Joe from the CTO office. Joe, welcome to Germany, welcome to Münster.
Thank you.
Maybe to start it off, because sometimes some of the audiences, like all these wonderful titles, don't necessarily mean anything to everyone. What's in your daily role, actually, before we get into any other topics?
So the official title is Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for Europe, Middle East and Africa, but I think what that really means is, I always put it into CTO as three CTOs. The first one is Chief Technology Officer, which is what you'd expect. So my role there is helping on the strategy and direction for VMware. So I sit as part of Kit Colbert's office in the office of the CTO, representing the thoughts, people and partners and customers in EMEA and their direction and strategy into what we're doing. And that's down to, what do we build, buy, destroy, all the kind of things you'd expect. The second piece is Chief Talking Officer, which is this, and conferences and press and all the other kind of stuff, which people don't really realize, but is actually quite a large chunk of the job of this role. And the third one, which I like best, is Chief Therapy Officer. And Chief Therapy Officer is actually spending a lot of time with customers. I actually mentor a few CIOs and CTOs and join that secret club where we all talk to each other and there's no stupid questions, I think is the answer. Because I think one thing to understand in the role of a CTO, people expect you to know everything. And not everyone knows everything. So having a club of friends where you can admit that you don't know about something that someone else does and that kind of game too. So yeah, really three things.
Which is interesting, because I found similar things when I started the TikTok channel and other things, where we looked at the audience, and you get a lot of evaluation nowadays out of these systems. And we found that beside very young people, on the other side, we also had an average age range where I would say is like, this must be head of IT or something like that.
Yeah.
And we got people actually come back where some people in the beginning said it's like TikTok, it's like there is no customer whatsoever. And actually there were customers who came to us as like, finally someone explained the stuff in an easy language so that I could understand. Plus, I mean, in Germany, what we sometimes have is this language barrier. It's like not everybody is willing to at least publicly say that they don't understand if it's spoken in English or it's brought over in English, and then they are lost because of that. Yeah. So speaking about customers, it's like, what are current trends you would see customers are developing, let's say, maybe for the next 1-2 years? What are they looking for to build?
Well, so actually, if you talk about the key themes that I'm talking to customers about, it's less about technology and it's more about the stuff around the technology at the moment. So I'm having a lot of conversations around ESG, sustainability. There's upcoming legislation in Europe for certain size organizations, which is extending to more and more organizations, about reporting their carbon impact and their energy consumption. And so that's going to start coming down to IT. So we're talking more and more to IT departments that are starting to say, hey, wow, I finally need to start looking at what's in my data center and what it's consuming and optimizing it. And that's another conversation I'm having, is around energy and sitting with companies and them saying, well, actually, we really do need to do some consolidation, and we need to look at what we're doing in our data centers and where we're wasting energy and where we're overcommitted or undercommitted and all those kind of things. So I think there's a lot of optimization around energy pricing and a lot of people looking deeply into that. So that's sort of one of the key topics at the moment in terms of conversations I'm having with customers. And that's above all of the sort of multi-cloud, in the cloud, out the cloud, cloud first, cloud everything, all those kind of things, which is really interesting. But I think if there's a general trend in the industry right now, I think I've got it on a slide in a presentation I'm giving at the moment called Cloud First is not cool. And I think we're coming now to customers where they used to say, oh, we're cloud first. Now aren't cloud first. I think they're now realizing that actually that's probably not the best thing. So, and again, a lot of that's related to cost. A lot of that are people who've gone and pushed a whole bunch of stuff into cloud and then suddenly realize that actually maybe putting everything into cloud without thinking about it because we just think cloud is the most amazing thing to do is probably not the best idea.
And cloud, in the end, what I sometimes have to explain to customers, cloud doesn't necessarily mean it's in someone else's data center. It can be still on-prem, which is what for a lot of people is like moving into the cloud is a bit like what we did 20, 30 years ago by just moving something to an outsourcing data center or something like that, which is not the same. It's like, it's all about the agility, about the elasticity and all of these different features. And not just about, hey, let's move my workload out somewhere else, because that is something we could have been doing already for 20 plus years. That's really nothing new. I mean, looking back, when I started off in IT, I was actually developing term caps for Unix systems back in the days where you had a dial-up line and you're just your terminal in front of you. And let's face it, yes, technology has evolved. So what was the terminal was that a serial interface back then is now a VDI desktop or web application. But in reality, it hasn't really changed that much, as long as we don't put something like cloud and everything else on top and really utilize cloud as it is, and that has nothing to do with on-prem or anywhere else. So on the cloud side, how do you see currently what we have been talking a lot with customers lately around monitoring, getting control about the charges? I mean, energy is one of the things, but the other things is more and more customers come around and say, how do we do monitoring now that we have everything spread across tons of different clouds? How do we get to know how much we are spending, where, and is it wisely spent, or is it just creating hot air like what we did before in our data center, just now somewhere else, and someone else is even making money out of it?
I think that's probably the biggest challenge of cloud, is that people don't understand the cost models going into it, and they don't understand that different clouds charge in different ways, and different clouds charge for different things, and different clouds charge for ingress and egress. And I think the interesting thing there is, when we're looking at that as people are now architecting applications, we talk about multi-cloud applications. When I used to be an application developer on premises, I didn't care which component talked to what and how often, right? Or where I put my storage compared to where I put, the compute or whatever it was. When I'm building stuff that's in clouds or across multi-clouds, and those things have an associated cost, and my architecture of my application, I need to think about how things talk to each other and what's where, because there's a cost implied in that. I think that's a real challenge. So, people look at multi-cloud, and what they don't realize is that actually you need a different skill set. So if you're going to use multiple different clouds, you need different skill sets on different clouds. Those different skill sets extend to not only how you deploy and architect applications, but how the cost models sit across those as well, and security. And when you start doing multi-cloud security becomes a challenge. So I think really, when we looked at cross-cloud services and what we're doing with ARIA and what was vRealize, etc., I think it is that unique piece of being able to say, we talked about it years ago as globally consistent infrastructure, if you remember. But now to talk about globally consistent management, to know that I can bring in a whole different cloud, a different place to do something, but have that fit into my cost models, my security models, my management models, is really, really important, because actually the operation of these things is typically the most expensive thing in doing these things. Typically buying it's not the expensive bit, it's the running it, as you well know, is the expensive piece.
Yeah, and that's what we see across different customers. It's like we run this massive project with one of Germany's car manufacturers to bring 80,000 desktops into the cloud within, I think, the next 2 years. We have, I think, nearly 10,000 already done. And there now, a lot of the discussions is like, what do we do from an SLA perspective? I mean, that certainly is one of the areas where you see immediately the hyperscalers don't want to have that discussion. No. It's like, why do we need to discuss SLAs? Because we have SLAs on the data centers. Don't look behind them, is a bit of the feeling you get as soon as you start these discussions. Yeah. And the secondary piece out of it is, in that specific case, they were not so much looking into cost per desktop in the beginning, because they knew they needed to get rid of their data center. They knew for several reasons, because a lot of technology might have been outdated, contracts were running out. So there were a lot of good reasons to go there. But for me, still the most impressive discussion around putting a desktop into the cloud is most employees only work for 40 hours a week, and not 168 hours. Why have a complete massive infrastructure run for 168 hours a week if you only needed 30, 40 hours overall, and that combined with licensing and everything else? So even if you take the original cost per desktop out of the equation, also from an energy perspective and a lot of these other arguments, it's like there are good reasons to move it there, but you see there is this SLA topic, and initially we were thinking only about moving into Microsoft Azure, because that was where we had all the VDI infrastructure. Yeah. But now as we start kicking off these discussions around SLA and everything else, all of a sudden they come and say, it's like, yeah, maybe we need something else, because what's going to happen if Microsoft in a complete territory would go down? And those are discussions where it goes like, this is nothing I never really, it's like, this is so far off. But if you consider it from their perspective, is if they put all the desktops into the cloud,
and the cloud's gone.
And the cloud is for whatever reason, and no one is perfect. And we all know that. Whoever has been long enough in IT, you have heard all the wonderful messages from every vendor whatsoever. It's like, this has never happened before. Yeah. You are the first to actually see this incident, but it doesn't help you if all your desktops are in the cloud, and even if you have spread them across different continents. So multi-cloud is really a thing, even for something as a VDI desktop. And I think that's going to move us forward.
I think, well, so while you're on that, this multi-cloud, we need to be careful when we're into multi-cloud, especially the model you're talking about, because if one thing, the recent events, whichever event you want to pick globally, has made us look at supply chains. So we're all looking at physical supply chains. We're all looking at, actually now it's difficult to get cameras, it's difficult to get whatever it is because the chip's not in that, and the car manufacturers are having problems, etc., etc. What about software supply chains? And I don't think people have really thought that through. And as we look at multi-cloud, you need to think more about software supply chains. And what I mean by that is, and in fact, Corey Quinn talks about it in the cloud documentary that we did. You may say, oh, we're not in Amazon, right? We're not in Amazon. We don't have a risk in Amazon. And then you find that there's an outage in Amazon and your e-commerce site's not working because you're not in Amazon, but your shopping cart provider that you've gone to, they've got a subpart with a payments provider that happens to be in Amazon. And so because of that, your website might be up, customers might be able to put stuff in the shopping cart, but none of them can check out. And so when you're talking about that model and someone says, okay, we're going to move all our desktops to the cloud, you have to very carefully, in that resilience model, examine every part of that supply chain. Where it was all on site, it was quite easy because you owned it all. But now it's in the cloud, it's very different. Does that play into what you're doing there?
That's playing into it. So we take a very close look into all the communication paths. And one of the first things we identified is like, no matter what we do in the public clouds, especially in that specific case, is it's going to take us 6 weeks to get a new direct connect or express route or whatever you want to have. So one of the next things we need to evaluate in this project is whether we can get away, worst case, with an SD-wan or something like that solution as an interim solution in case of a disaster, or whether we really need additional lines, which is going to be expensive because we are not talking about just a gigabit if you put 10,000 of desktops out there. Whether we need that constant line, because if it takes us weeks to get the new line up, potentially even internally, if we script everything, 1 or 2 weeks until we have all the backend services for the VDI back up and running. So there is a hell of a lot more you need to do, and you need to figure out is like how much of the user data actually has to survive. It's like, I mean, there is always the wish, don't want to lose anything. But there is also something where you need to decide, it's like if as a corporate, I have already decided that no one is to store anything on their desktop in the first place. It's like, do we really need to recover anything from there in case of an outage?
There'll always be someone.
There is typically always someone, and that someone is typically very high up in the chain. It's like, it always reminds me of one customer we once had where with mobile device management, their iPad was like, no. I'm doing my own backups, and IT doesn't need to do my backups. As like C-level executive, and then all of a sudden the iPad actually broke, and all of a sudden it was a massive issue, and he had to face the wonderful experience that even 2 of the data recovery companies told him, it's like, yeah, that device was perfectly well encrypted. We can't actually bring any of your data back. Even if we reassemble all of this, it's like, it's gone. It's like, you should have done a backup. And then we had lengthy discussions that he can't remember that anybody has always told him to have backups being done by the IT department and stuff like that. But no, coming back to the VDI story, in the end, it's a lot of complexity you need to solve. It's not only, hey, where do I get my desktop image and how do I get my applications, which in this specific case, we are talking about thousands of applications which we need to sort on the site as well. But actually, how do we get all of these surrounding pieces identified, which is another challenge because that means you have to go fight through security and a bunch of other people. Because normally you would potentially say, let's just put some logging or monitoring systems in between and just check where these desktops are connecting, which again, large car manufacturers, some of these desktops are in the engineering department, is guess what? The security team does not allow you to actually put something like that onto a desktop, where they go, it's like, hell no. It's like, you can ask us what they communicate with, but you are not going to be in the position that you can track them or do anything. And so it's a bit of a challenge, but all of these things are coming in. Again, this also proves on the other side, when we have been looking with them over the applications in the last couple of weeks or months, is all the cloud native story is nice, but reality is there is so much legacy stuff which is not going to go away. And we found other interesting things by analytics, is like people are starting an SAP client because that brings a different browser, we figured out. And with that browser, they can access more than with the normal browser icon they have as an application on the desktop. And so again, shows also users are very creative to solve things, because we were surprised. It's like, why do we have thousands of SAP users which are never really consuming any of the SAP applications? And so a lot of analytics backend stories had to be done. And then we figured out how to get from A to B and what applications. But again, it's like cloud native is great, having web applications is great, but we still, in this specific case, are stuck with thousands of applications which still need to move over to whatever the new home is going to be.
Well, there's an interesting point on that, right? So there's two things there. Users are rarely deliberately malicious, which is two very English words there, but people look at users, all those SAP people, they're not deliberately being bad. They've not sat there that day and gone, oh, I'm going to work out how to annoy IT or go against corporate policy. That's not what they did. What they did is, I'm trying to work out how to get my job done. Right? I think that's the first thing to understand. So one thing I've learned in 30 years of doing this game is usually it's just people trying to find the best way to get their job done. So that happens. But the other, to your point, is, the list of customers I've got that I've sat down opposite them and gone, we're going all in on the cloud. We're going cloud native, and we're going to have 50% of our applications in the cloud within 2 years. And fine, 8-9 years ago, people used to go, that's really cool, I'd like to hear that plan. Now most people like myself just smile and go, good luck with that, I think is the answer. And I think realistically, most customers get 5% done if they're lucky. And they realize actually that the cost benefit of going through that effort of rewriting something to be cloud native, as opposed to just finding a way to run it in a different model somewhere else, slightly cheaper, which is actually, and then you have to ask yourself the question, why are we going to cloud in the first place, right? Are we going to cloud because someone said cloud is cool, right? Are we going to cloud because it's cheaper, because it's more secure, because it's faster, more resilient? What's the reason we're going there? And what's the better about cloud that we're looking for? And I think that's really, if you want to look at what the conversations we're having are now, is I think when you talk about cloud smart, as we do at VMware, it's much more about thinking, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you going to? What's the real reasoning behind this? And my CEO played golf with someone from a hyperscaler, and they said it was cool. It's not the answer anymore, but it used to be.
And I think that's something we've seen. Weird enough, not only at the end customer side. I mean, we do a lot of business also with service providers. And whenever we start an architecture project and we actually ask them, it's like, we want to have someone from sales, marketing, and other departments in the design discussion. They go, it's like, why? They have no clue about what they are talking about. It's like, yeah, but they are selling your services to customers. So even in the provider scale, it's like we see it often enough that people come and say, it's like, we don't need any of these people. We have done all of that. And then you build something, you design, architect, build it up. And then you end up in a scenario where you actually present it for the first time to all these people which have been questioned before. And they go, it's like, yeah, that's great, but this is nothing we can sell to customers, or this is not actually solving our business problems on the commercial or enterprise side. And this is why it's so important to actually take the steps back and actually take IT out of the, not out of the equation, but actually make sure that all the other users are involved. Because if you don't get any users involved, it's like you are lost. You're building something which is exactly ending in a scenario where IT defines how the business should operate, and IT is similar to many other departments in the company, just a supplier to generate revenue in most cases, as long as you're not a data company.
So this is a point I've been telling CIOs for years, and I think this is an opportunity for lots of people, is you go to the IT department and you ask them, where's your sales department and where's your pre-sales department? And they look at you sort of a bit quizzically as what on earth are you on about, Joe? If I go, but yet they tell me they're suffering from shadow IT, and they tell me that all these cloud providers are doing cool stuff, and the business is coming to them and saying, oh, we need to buy this cool stuff. So when you go to the IT department, you go, well, let's look at, if I'm the business, if I'm the head of sales, I've got someone that comes to me from, SaaS provider and says, here's the cool SaaS app, here's the way I'm going to make it work with your people, here's how it's going to change their process, here's how it's going to support them, make you better, sell more things. No IT department ever speaks to the head of sales like that. No IT department ever goes to the head of sales and goes, I've got this great new product, here's the technical people that are going to interface with your business and work how we get it to work the best, here's the people that are going to deploy it, here's the sales process. So I think if anything, IT departments, CIOs, etc., can learn from the fact that they look at software companies and the consultancies that support them and say, how do you sell to businesses?
And it is, in the end, it is often, and it's not new. I mean, I started off more in a SaaS business. I was dealing with enterprise applications for quite a long time, and even there you had the wonderful experiences like, yeah, just implement it the way you do it at any other company, which that's always the alarm bell. When someone says it's like, let's just do it like everybody else does it, it's like, okay, so you're basically one of these golf course scenarios because someone else told you need to do that, so let's just implement this. Or you have no clue why you're implementing it, and so that means we need to get to the why first before we can actually start doing any implementations. Companies have enough shelfware. There is absolutely no reason, and especially as we potentially walk into some more cost-constrained years ahead of us, companies are going to look much more closely into, is it really going to be necessary to do this or not? And so asking the why question, I think, is becoming more and more important moving forward.
Well, and I sit now opposite IT leaders, and I sat opposite one in Brussels recently. He looked at me and said, okay, I'm part of the public sector. I know for a fact that my budget for the next 5 years is going to increase at 2% a year. That's it. Yet I'm sat here looking at my IT vendors telling me their prices are going up 10% a year or 20% a year. He said, so I don't have a magic money tree. I need to look at what I've got, and I need to think a lot more seriously about what I buy in the future, but also how I, as we talked about earlier, optimize and consolidate and make the most of what I've already got. And that's a conversation we're having a lot. Are you seeing that with customers too?
Yes, that's actually something we currently see come more and more. It's not necessarily about getting rid of software, but it's like, are we utilizing the software we have to the maximum extent? Are we getting the best value out of it? Potentially things like what we have been talking about for the last 10 plus years with, hey, you should right size your VMs, you should do all these things.
Yeah.
And for many years in IT, it's for many people, because right sizing always meant you have to spend extra time on doing that. It was very often, it's like, let's just throw more hardware at it. And when I sometimes see the difference between some small and medium businesses where you look at the IT and say, it's like, this is actually good enough for a few thousand employees, what the hell were you doing? And it was just, for them, it was easier than trying to figure out why it's slow, just throw more at it. And this, I think, is going to come to an halt, because on one hand, we still have the supply chain scenarios, and speaking to friends in the chip industry is like, you always get mixed answers. It's like, if it's on record, everybody says it's going to be perfect next year. If it's off record, it's more like, it's like, hell, be prepared, this is going to potentially take 2 or 3 more years until we ever have this solved, because even if we build all these production places now, it's going to take us 2 or 3 years until they are in production, because just for these clean rooms, which was one of the things which I learned, is like, just to build the clean, or to operate the clean room, it takes at least 6 months of preparation to use that. So even if they build fast, and not to take the American approach, is like, instead of 1 woman to deliver the child, let's just use 9 and then it's done in 1 month. It's not working like that. And I think what we see at the customers is they are far more cost constrained. They also have to deal with the fact that they don't get any people. So that is another thing they need to solve.
The skills shortage is a real problem.
So what we see and what we do with a lot of customers is really refocus with them. And one of the first strategic approaches, which I do with CIOs very often, is like, let's sit down and really identify within your IT, is like, what should you run yourself?
Yeah.
and what is something which we can put to a managed service or outsourcing or whatever else type of fashion so that you are not actually operating. I had that with a furniture company a few months back, or it's nearly a year back, where I had a session with their CIO and CEO, and basically it's like they were not utilizing in that specific case Microsoft 365, but basically had outsourced their complete cash register system. Where I said, it's like, guys, it's like, it should be the opposite way around, because if your cash registers don't work on a Saturday, it's like, how long is it going to take that supplier to come in and solve it? It's like, and they said, it's like, yeah, we have an agreement of 4 hours Monday to Friday. And I said, it's like, so you are closing stores on Saturday then? No, we can do this manually. And I said, it's like, look, I'm potentially one of the high spenders in any of your stores because I don't necessarily look that much behind all of it. But I would not actually wait for 1 hour in the queue. I'm expecting to be done in 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. Otherwise, I'm actually going to walk away because there are other stores to solve this. So we need to get that back into your control so that you have 100% control about it. Whereas other things, it's like you shouldn't be thinking about building a SharePoint site or an Exchange server for 200 employees. That's not paying any money for you. So really refocus on what's sensible to operate yourself, what's generating business differentiator, which is another key point is like operating something which is not differentiating you from any of your competitors. If it's cheaper or even if it's the same price, even if it's maybe a bit more expensive, because your headcount on IT is very often limited. And with not getting more budget, a more competitive marketplace out there, it's more likely that you really need to refocus. It's like, what should my IT people do? Plus, honestly, no one really likes to operate base infrastructure anymore, do Windows updates and things like that. Get that done by someone who can completely automate that. So revisiting that, looking at overall cost and utilization of IT infrastructure, I think is moving into the next few years going to be a big topic. Whilst at the same point in time, what we also see, which I think where in Europe we lag a bit behind, and maybe you have a different opinion from some of the customers you talk about, is many companies are still telling me, we are not a development company, we are not a data company, we don't actually care about all of this, which I think is wrong, because if you see it on the other side, when I look at our US business, because nearly 50% of our business is actually in the US, companies over there see it completely different. They are typically 1 or 2 or 3 years ahead from an IT operation perspective anyway. But I think in Europe we are still lagging behind, and we are sometimes blocking ourselves with data privacy laws and just make things complicated for no reason, because then you talk to legal people and they go, it's like, hey, it's not even that complicated if you really do it seriously.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion? Is like, do we need more development data companies, or should especially the, let's say, legacy companies refocus a bit more on these topics?
Well, your point about focusing on differentiating technology, I think, is a key one to understand in that. So, like you say, my furniture store's not going to be better than your furniture store because I do email better than you, right? It's not going to happen. So, whereas my furniture store is going to be better than your furniture store because if the app that engages with my customers is better than yours and has better different features and enables me to, visualize the furniture in my room, all those kind of things. So I think people are starting to realize that. I think the challenge we have over here in Europe is scale. Most organizations are not big enough to run a development department. They don't seem to have that. There's a lot of off the shelf. So if you're looking over here generally, there's huge companies, of course there's huge companies, but as a percentage of the total business sizes, most of them are what we call small to medium enterprises, especially when you look a lot across certain countries. And so with those, they're buying off-the-shelf software. They're mainly buying it, so they've got a history and a heritage of buying and configuring off-the-shelf software, not developing software, not writing stuff. So there isn't a huge culture within those organizations of doing development. And so we're working with some of those to understand how you start off that culture development, how you start to differentiate. But I think you've got to find some kind of differentiating need to do that. And a lot of people do that wrong by saying, I'm going to get developers in, and typically what those developers are doing is their developers are customizing off-the-shelf software. That's what, you come across all the time where we go, oh, what does that team do? Oh, well, they take PeopleSoft and they reconfigure PeopleSoft to work for us, right? Or they can reconfigure SAP. Their development teams typically is making SAP tailored for them, or making PeopleSoft tailored for them, or whatever it is, rather than going, let's talk to the business, let's get to developers and do that. I think that's probably the big shift that we need to go through, that maybe you've got a scale thing in America, and organizations typically are larger, that they just reach that critical mass scale where they're doing that.
I think the other thing we see in the US, and that was interesting because that was in one of the analyst sessions I did earlier this year, where some of them said it's like potentially the lifetime for some of these legacy applications, including things like SAP, is maybe over. Because in the past, companies needed something like SAP because it was the only solution where they could go to get all the services. Whereas when you now look out there in the industry, you get hundreds of payment providers.
Yes.
You get hundreds of companies who give you microservices for invoicing, for tax handling, for accounting, for all these kinds of things. And what I see actually is some companies who really say is like, okay, instead of just revisiting how we are going to rebuild SAP or Oracle or Navision or whatever else, or Dynamics now, let's take a moment and think about if we were to build it completely for ourselves. And we had logistics companies who started that journey 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago. And back 2 years ago, they said it's like, look, all we do in logistics, whatever we get from most of the software vendors, is half-baked. It's not really a specific solution for us. So let's completely rethink what we need. Let's take the existing IT team and continue to run existing environments. And basically, they did not necessarily do this primarily to become a software company, but they said it's like, let's build a new team and actually start evaluating what should we build ourselves, where can we integrate external services, and build a complete new landscape around how to operate the enterprise. And they said from the beginning, it's like, this is going to take us 5 or 10 years until we really get to the point that we could switch over our business. We might be able to switch certain services beforehand. And as they started that journey and were more publicly talking about that journey, they had competitors show up and say, it's like, yeah, we might be not like you, but the idea you have there is like, could we potentially get that?
Yeah.
And because that's the other part is when you, and it's said, it's like, I mean, I started off in ERP, it's like, there is barely no customer or no company out there who's happy with their ERP system. It's like everybody is complaining about that it's not solving their business needs, it has all kinds of issues, and it's just eating up memory. Money. So when you look at all of these systems just eating up money, it's like it's maybe the point in time where our companies need to revisit that and revisit how they operate, and whether SaaS, microservices, cloud native, or something like that becomes an option. And that means you need to have developers, you need to have a platform to bring all of that together, and maybe build your own application for your own needs, and maybe have that something as a competitive advantage to either keep it for yourself or create a new business out of it in renting or selling that to your competitors, worst case.
I think so, but you've raised a really good point there, in that's, cloud is not about it's cloud or not cloud. What cloud's actually doing is just adding a lot more choices to the choices we already have. So it's not, okay, we're going to go to cloud and cloud's the way we're going, or we're going to stay on premises. It's the case that actually, in the future, I've got a choice of more components, more choices of how I build things and how I do things. The challenge with more choice is that most IT architects, if they're not careful, can be like children, which is if you go in the toy shop and say, what are you going to have? They say, I'll have everything, please. And can I bring it all home and play with all of it, please, Dad? Whereas in fact, you need to, so how do you, and I think that's probably an opportunity around someone like comdivision for the next 10 years, is how do you help the architects not build Frankenstein, but instead build the elegant solution of the best components from the best bits of the cloud in a way that's sustainable, and they're not going to find themselves in the future architected into a corner. I suppose that's a real balance and a real delicate challenge, right?
It is one of these challenges, and it's sometimes driving you crazy because you have, especially when you talk to larger enterprise accounts, you have the wonderful experience that clearly there are salespeople from the licensing side, there are people from product management who want to sell the latest, greatest, and biggest solutions. And sometimes it feels like we are that ugly kid who has to come into the room and basically destroy everything first. Where it's guys like, and I had such a case lately with a larger German service provider where they came as like, look, and we have built this network with VRF and this and that and all these cross connects and multiple uplinks and all of this. And I was like, it's like, and why? And they were just like, yeah, but this is the most advanced way on how we can build this. It's like, do you have any customer who has any need for this? It's like, we don't know, but we were told that they might all need it. It's like, does any of your customers have a real need for this? And then again, you actually find yourself in the battlefield between, sometimes in that case, vendor, us as an advisor, and customer. It's like, guys, let's focus on what we really need. It's like, it's great that we have all these technologies. It's great that we have all these features, but let's focus on what is actually bringing value to the customer first, and then figure out what's going to be next, and maybe evolve out of it, which also shortens the time frame to get it up and running. Because if you don't build something complex and you're not the first one to start off with the most modern technologies, and clearly there are companies who need to do that, but when you refocus and really look at it, it's like, what do we need, why do we need it, and how do we build it first, and be more agile. I think I see very often that also many IT architects are still more in this old waterfall approach, instead of just let's build something, see if it works, if it fails, let's fix it and redo it. Versus let's build a complex design for 6 months and actually then start implementing it for another 6 to 9 months to then figure out that no one needs it. Versus let's build small building blocks and actually let's get things going fast, fail fast if necessary, and then actually reevaluate and fix it again.
So when I go and find a complex architecture like that, like the one you described, that's another one of the problems we have in our industry. So problem number one is CIO or CEO playing golf with someone and having a really cool idea. That's a big problem. The other problem when I go in and see a large architecture like that is I ask the question, okay, so which of you architects has now got a really nice CV that you wanted, or which of you people in IT now has all the qualifications in the new technology that you were looking for? Because that's you have to be very careful that people are looking for technology for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons as they go through that. So another trend, when you asked me at the beginning, sort of what are the key things I'm seeing, comes back to that supply chain problem, commoditized hardware. I think we're going to see over the next 2 or 3 years the rising commodity hardware. And so I want to ask, I've got a question for you. I'm seeing more customers say to me, actually, I went and spec'd out some network equipment and then I went to order it and was told it's going to take me 9, 12, 18 months for them to ship me that network equipment. So instead, I've realized that what I can do is I can buy some off-the-shelf x86 servers from Dell or HPE, and I can get them shipped within a month, and I'll do it all in software. Do you think that's really going to drive too?
I think it's something we see already, because when we think back, let's say 10 years, we were far more focused on doing the right sizing for a specific hardware box in the first place. Mm-hmm. Whereas now it's like, what are we looking at least when we build typical VMware style environments? It's in most cases, it's 2 socket systems. It's almost all the same. It's just a question is like, who's putting the label in front of it. So yes, there are changes in components, and when we talk about high performance or something like that, we need to modify it. But commodity is becoming more and more of a commodity, and it's always a question which I also ask customers is like, okay, so when we look at it from an availability and serviceability and everything else perspective, is it really the, let's say, exclusive vendor you need, or should we just throw 2, 3 more of these boxes into the rack, and actually if one dies, the other one is going to take over, mm-hmm. Which is, I think, overall a much more appropriate approach, looking at it, learning it from the cloud approach, instead of trying to build everything completely fail-safe.
Yeah.
Just actually go with something which is easier to implement, easier to operate, and if something fails, it's going to restart somewhere else again and just come back. I mean, this is the whole world around Kubernetes, how many build their applications. And whoever actually looks in that is always where I go, is like, go read the Netflix documentation about how they built their initial infrastructure. That tells you a lot on how you should build new IT infrastructure in the first place. It's going to save you a hell lot of money, because a lot of these fail-safe features are very expensive to get them from most of the vendors. It's very expensive to implement and operate, which is in the end the much higher cost in the end. You need to test them regularly, because otherwise you are going to have that wonderful power outage or something else and figure out it's like, yeah, 90% of the components came up, but damn, we forgot about the domain controller or something stupid like that. And now we are still lost. So trying to figure out what's really coming in there, and commodity, I think when we talk about commodity from an infrastructure and services perspective, and that perfectly fits into the multi-cloud story as well, is if we make sure that any of our workloads, whether it's a virtual machine or a Kubernetes workload or something else, is built in a way that we can easily move it from A to B and have it in multiple places, building redundancy, building reliability, and all of these things becomes a lot easier. And this is something where very often when people talk to me, it's like, why should I use, for example, things like VMC over just making it a native EC2 instance? Where I go, it's like, look, the advantage is I can take your VM today from on-prem, move it into the cloud, and if tomorrow morning we figure out it's not working there or we have some other issues, we can move it out or we can move it into a different cloud. Yes, there are fees and costs and all of that applied to it, but the huge advantage of using the VMware approach in that specific way is because I'm not creating dependency. Yes, I mean, it's always the story is like whoever actually defines the login is actually not talking about it themselves as a login.
Oh, yeah.
But the question for me is, do I want to have a login from an Amazon or Microsoft, or do I want to have something from someone like VMware where I can then at least pick between all these different clouds or actually go back into an on-prem scenario?
And that's difficult to get across to people sometimes. So when people talk about what you give us at VMware, I say I give you openness and choice. And they sort of look at you a bit quizzically and go, you give me openness and choice? It's like, well, yeah, you've got a choice of all the clouds right now, but if you do go and migrate your stuff to be native in one of those clouds, the choice you then have is moving around within that one cloud. It's much harder to have a choice to then move to another cloud, exactly as you so well articulated. Whereas we're giving you the openness and choice to say, okay, you've agreed to stay in the VMware ecosystem, but look at the size of it. Look how big the VMware ecosystem is, and the choice that you've got of moving across those, I think, is really important. You know, I think that's a key message, I think, to land with people. You're right. So yeah, the word lock-in comes up a lot when I talk to customers, but you know, everyone's locked in somewhere. I think the definition of lock-in is where you see the value, and I think that's really important. So if the value to you is in that openness and choice, in that consistency of operations, that consistency of management, security, etc., while still having the choice of moving in and out and all over the place, I think it's a big thing.
And you still have the lock-in anyway. I mean, you're more or less locked in either our friend Pat or the AMD world anyway.
Well, like, true, yeah.
So you have lock-ins anyhow, and
if you go far enough down, you're locked into something, right? You're all locked into TCP/IP, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Yeah, but you're not paying extra for it. So, but in the end, it's all, you have all of these scenarios, and you just need to figure out. But the point is, what a lot of people also tend to forget in the VMware ecosystem very often is that beside these massive hyperscalers, we have 1,000 or nearly 5,000 or 4,000 to 5,000 smaller service providers, or smaller, so I'm not necessarily sure if I would consider someone like OVH or Ionos or something like that really a small service provider. But we have all of them. We have very niche specific ones which are highly specialized on operating HANA or something else. Considering that, if I'm built on VMware stack, if something from a regulation whatsoever perspective would come across, it would still be easy to just move my workload to a safe haven, to a sovereign cloud in the European ecosystem. And I have all that choice, or going back on-prem. But going back on-prem is what we currently see some customers come up with a crazy idea. It's like, yeah, we are going to actually get rid of completely of our data center by mid of next year. It's like, okay, do you really think you should completely get rid of everything?
Yeah.
Because that's this extreme step, which I think came out of this cloud first and all of that. I think some companies recognize it's like, it's a good thing to have a few servers back there.
I think most people we talk to now realizing they're going to have some form of capability of where they're going to do processing. So, but you raised a really good point. So VCPP is one of my favorite topics. I've been a VCPP champion within VMware for quite a while, I should say. And one of my favorite conversations was once being in South Africa, and a journalist, Kathy, who's a good friend of mine now, actually asked me the question a few years ago, so are you excited about the cloud coming to South Africa? And I went, I'm not sure what you mean. She said, well, you know, Microsoft are coming to South Africa with Azure. I said, I've already got over 40 clouds in South Africa. I don't know, one more isn't that exciting, you know? So I think that VCPP piece is really important. But the other thing I've ended up as, purely by virtue of being situated and being the EMEA CTO, is I've been the champion, if you ask frankly, within VMware of sovereign cloud. And you mentioned cloud sovereignty there as well as a key topic. We've launched the Sovereign Cloud Initiative at VMware and help define that, because cloud sovereignty is a hugely hot topic over here in Europe, we have hyperscalers trying to build sovereign clouds and lots of sovereign cloud things, but actually what we're seeing is the lead in the market is being taken by these OVHs and other companies that are building specific sovereign clouds to meet various regulations or various market needs or whatever that is. And it's great to sit with someone else who understands that problem, but also champions something like VCPP, because VCPP is huge for us, and I think it will be going forward. So do you see, I want to dig a little bit more into cloud sovereignty with you if I could. So do you see cloud sovereignty as being a big thing for you going forwards, architecting for your customers? Or how many do you care about it or don't care about it?
I think it's for us, it's two-sided still. Similar to us doing half our business in the US, half here in Europe. Mm-hmm. We have a similar topic that I think nearly 1/3 of our business is actually building architecture for VCPP providers. So we have to deal with that on a daily basis. And we see, whereas in the beginning for the sovereign cloud, initially it was a complete rise. It's like, we all need to do that. Mm. Then it actually stagnated or even went down. It's like, oh, we really feel customers don't care about it, so why should we? And it's slowly taking up again because still we have, I think, a huge need in Europe for certain industries. Because especially when I talk to public sector or certain other industries, we will not get all of these services into AWS or Microsoft. As much as Microsoft, AWS, and Google try to do that, there will constantly be a threat that someone is going to kill off that service. Plus, what we need to keep in mind is that we have, and we should actually be doing some of these services on our own soil with our own services, similar to what the US does as well. It's like there is nothing wrong in actually having a European company involved in certain services, right? And we can do them perfectly well. When I see what some of our VCPP providers do here in Europe, they are far more specialized. And this is something which I also keep telling some of the providers. If someone tells me, it's like, yeah, our unique selling point or our unique selling proposition is going to be because we have our data center in Europe, where I can tell them, it's like, look guys, this is not going to convince any customer. It's good to have it on top of your other either niche specification or something else, but just sovereign cloud is not good enough. You need to have something else. Combining it with additional services where you can differentiate yourself from an AWS, from Microsoft or something else is going to help you, because there are certain things which these big guys can't do.
Well, that differentiation could be an SLA.
That differentiation can be an SLA. That differentiation can also be custom infrastructure. I mean, you can go to AWS and say, it's like, I need that specific hardware with that specific GPU, and AWS will come, it's like, look, that's not a problem. You need to actually procure at least 100 of these hosts in each one of the availability zone data centers. And then we are going to build that for you. And then you go, it's like, yeah, but I only wanted to have 4 or 5 of these nodes. And they go, it's like, no. And the other things is you might have other custom needs. It's like, try to convince AWS that you need to have a USB dongle for something involved in your system. It's like, that's an absolute no-go. Plus, from a security perspective, you might not want to have Amazon get that stick because that might have specific crypto or other informations on it. So there are a lot of specific solutions where these providers can differentiate, and then combine that with sovereign cloud, I think is a perfect match. And as we look at all of this is also from a cost perspective. Very often I hear the good old term is like, yeah, but Microsoft, Google, etc. is actually going to be cheaper. What I see out there when I see what price offerings these VCPP providers often can do is they can actually be far more attractive, and not only because of volume or anything else. If you take the overall cost, also including services, because AWS, for example, by themselves do not really offer any kind of additional managed services around them. They do that through partners, but even there it's highly regulated and managed and controlled. And it's very difficult to understand who is going to be the bad guy if something goes wrong. Whereas if I'm going to, let's say, one of the VCPP providers, I can basically agree with them on specific managed services where I say, look, I don't want to manage Windows anymore, but I still want to be the admin in the house. I don't want to actually manage that specific application, but I want to have complete backups. And all of these things are things you can actually control and discuss with these VCPP providers. Yeah. And that's, I think, the huge difference in comparison to the large-scale corporations, And sometimes I must also say, especially for these family-owned businesses, or let me take into that equation the car manufacturer where we do the VDI story.
Yeah.
One of the lessons they had to learn, which was, I think, for them and their procurement team, the first experience like that in many years, is that on the other side of the table, a vendor would say, no.
Yeah, because I'm bigger than you.
I'm bigger than you, and I'm not going to make an exception, even if you want to host 80,000 desktops with me. It's like, this is what I can give you. And even if you demand that you want to have 5,000 desktops next week in Amsterdam, I'm going to say no.
Yeah.
Because I have 800 other customers who also want to have VDIs, and I'm not going to give all my resources to you, or I'm not going to customize the way how I'm operating this. And these are things where some of these smaller providers can be more helpful. And also when you have legacy applications, if you go through the terms and conditions of people like AWS and some of the other ones, they will tell you you cannot operate an end-of-life, end-of-service system in most cases, as long as you can't prove that you have an agreement with Microsoft that you can still operate Windows 2000, which is, when I look at some of the latest VMC migrations we have done, you come across these. It's like they happen more often than sometimes people think, and that's where sometimes you also have to remind customers. It's like, you remember that number is not a version number. That was actually the plan here where Microsoft thought to introduce it. Usually they were a year earlier than that. Sometimes in that year, it's like, and now think about 2000 and now look on your calendar again. Do you really think it's like, that's basically an adult? That would normally be someone which you, if it's your child, it's not living in your house anymore. It's like, and let's treat that workload in a similar way. Get it out of your house.
We have a customer that's running NT4 in VMC.
Oh, I could take my old MCSE NT4 and NT3.5 skills back to service.
There, yeah. My first Microsoft qualification MCP was in NT Workstation 3.5.1, which I took in French actually, which is a whole different story. I'll tell you one day. So one of the topics I really want to talk to you about is, we've talked a lot about cloud, but let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, edge. Edge is a huge topic in our industry at the moment. You know, I've been working on a project which has finally come out, Nano Edge, with the XR4000 box. We've got that 2.1 piece of kit with Dell, etc. And it's a big topic for a lot of our customers, because when you talk about these new distributed applications, these new cloud smart environments, we're looking at deploying parts of those applications and composed applications in the edge, in the retail stores, in the back of police cars, in the whatever. How's that playing out in the comdivision world in terms of that edge architecture?
Edge architecture comes up more and more often now. As companies are moving their workloads into the cloud, they figure out it's like, hey, we have this big manufacturing place, or we have some of these other components where it's just not feasible to move everything out, either because we can't really guarantee the latencies, which is still for certain systems an issue, or we have to deal with just manufacturing scenarios. We have a PVC manufacturer, for example. For them, if the connection to certain systems would break down, that basically means they are going to lose a complete production shift potentially, or they might even have to recalibrate all the machineries, which is going to take them days. So the overall outage is massive, so you have to deal with these scenarios. You have to deal with other scenarios, because now that we talk more openly in Europe about things like, hey, we might have a blackout or things like that as well. Whereas I have worked in my very, very early days in the ISP business and telco business, and I know has become really much better. It's like, let's face it, it's going to be not necessarily even 24 hours until all the communication links are going to break down, as soon as all the other infrastructure is down. And then it doesn't help you that you have the most wonderful 2 connection uplinks if both of them are down, because the blackout is actually in a region larger than, let's say, 20 kilometers. There is a high chance both of the communication stations you are utilizing are going to be affected, which is one of the areas why we actually see more and more customers take up things like Starlink, and just saying it's like, then I have a satellite uplink, maybe that's going to work. But this is why we will still need edge computing somewhere in some of these places, because you need to have certain things on-prem. And I have seen data centers in the past where data centers had blackouts and no one could actually enter the building anymore, because guess what? The entry control system was running on a software piece inside the data center. luckily, the advice I always learned is like the easiest thing to get into a data center is worst case is make sure that you get a fire alert, because the fire department always has a back door. So there are ways for them to get in without damaging the complete building. They will do that as well, but that's not what you want in a data center scenario. But these are reasons why we need edge. You cannot be depending that all of that infrastructure is going to be up and running all the times. And so looking at all of that, edge is going to come. We see edge in more and more places, as you said, like the back of a police car, or we are currently running a project where we are discussing disaster recovery with a large cruise ship company, and they have similar scenarios. It's like, how do you deal with this? It's because the initial idea is like, hey, we push everything into the cloud. And then you figure out, it's like, okay, so if the satellite uplink for a ship would go down, for example, it's like, how do we deal with that from that perspective? Because you need to have some set of the data on the ship. I mean, we can replicate it out to the cloud, but if then the local compute actually dies, what do you do? So I think that's becoming more and more of a scenario. The other thing is, as we still don't have endless bandwidth availability, there is a huge case for edge computing for initial data processing before you push all that data, because this is something which I think people learned over IoT and all these things in the last 1 or 2 years. It's like, the cloud initially sounds like a great idea, and let's just always push all the data into the cloud.
Massive data lake, and just put it in there and decide.
Up until the point they get this wonderful invite from the big hyperscalers in, it's like, hey, let's have a talk. Our board wants to meet you. It's like, damn, we are potentially spending far too much money with them. We should actually figure out how to decrease that, because there was a time period within the last 5 years where people were just actually, whatever data they could generate, just let's put it into the cloud. We might put it to use at a later point in time.
Yeah.
And I think this is something where people now see is like, with edge computing, this gives me the chance that I can also at least analyze some of the data on-prem, reduce potentially some of the data volume, or actually push some of the data on some external archiving whatsoever system, instead of directly pushing it into the cloud, because I might later on come back and actually need it for something, but it's definitely not worthwhile having it running in an active data lake somewhere in the cloud. So those are scenarios we have to deal with, I think, more and more in the future. But also, as cities, buildings, etc. become more smart, not all of them are going to be grid connected the whole time. Not all of them are going to be able to operate on the grid the whole time. Am I really willing to accept the fact that I potentially can't open a door anymore because it's an electronic key system? Am I willing to accept that I can't turn the lights on the way I wanna because I have a bus system, but the bus system basically died. I can't restart it because it's depending, like many of these, and that is something which I see, many of these easier building automation systems are depending on a cloud service.
Yeah.
So will I have connectivity at any point in time? Can I still control it? Can I use that? And reality is in most cases, no. Because when you look at that, and people don't recognize that the internet and everything has become that fast that it's no longer a problem. If you switch the button in some of these systems, actually the call from the button goes first back to the central system to then tell the light bulb to actually go on. Mm-hmm. And all of these scenarios, I mean, for a small home building, it's like worst case, you just reconstruct or you just draw a power line, but this is not going to work for office buildings, for a lot of other things. So I think we have a huge scenario for edge use cases. We will have more also, I think, in a lot of public sector scenarios as we finally take our journey, I think, here in Europe, more and more to digitize public sector as well.
Yeah.
Is we will see the value out of it. I mean, a good friend of mine works for the local fire department, and it's not that many years ago that they switched to having tablets and things like that where they have the maps and everything on it. Yeah. Whereas they actually had paper maps in every lead car for nearly all the main buildings, which was not only an issue from that the maps were potentially outdated or not the correct ones were in the cars. The other problem, it's a massive security issue. Yeah, because if you get hold of one of these cars, that basically gives you building plans of some of the most critical infrastructure in the city. So there are all these scenarios where it makes sense. And again, of their fire departments also tell you it's like, we cannot have these maps or all of this be dependent on the fact that we have communication. We just had the case a few months back in Germany, where for an area of, I think, really nearly 100 kilometers, the digital radio communication system from police and fire departments actually was dying. In the end, they figured out what was wrong. It was actually another state government actually driving with their complete escort of cars through a certain area, and in one of the tunnels, they basically should have never happened, but in one of the tunnels, their jamming signals to protect their cars was actually so massive that it actually interfered with the internal communication, so that in the tunnels the police and fire department could communicate. That backfired into the complete network and actually took the complete network offline.
Wow.
And instead of them being able to quickly restart it, they try to fix it, which is the typical approach. We all know that in IT and in many other things. It's like you try to fix it instead of then someone just taking the final decision. Is like, we can't fix it. It's like, we are just going to take it completely down and restart it from the beginning. Like the good old, have you tried turning it off and on again? But that's the case. And all of this infrastructure, and again, that showcased is like, having digital, highly encrypted communication systems is a great idea in the first place. But in the end, it might also mean that if we have a major outage, the analog radio systems actually also had their advantages.
Yeah.
So
I mean, we work with BAE Systems, and they put a system onto all of the British Navy ships. They call the floating cloud, and that's really interesting because it's also on nuclear submarines. And so that model is, this thing needs to be standalone. It needs to be able to be supported by people without too many IT skills, because we don't have VMware admins on every naval ship. Strangely, it's not a role that you can go into. There's limited quality. So we need to build systems that are almost self-maintaining in that context, but it also gives them the flexibility on there as well. So in that scenario, one of the benefits of running a floating cloud is if a piece of hardware goes down, they can move something very quickly to another piece of hardware without having to, go through a whole bunch of problems, because it's got that separation from what's going on. But I think, we're seeing a rise in the industry, to all the examples you just talked about, of an increase in edge competency, an increase in understanding that not everything's going to be in a cloud, not everything's going to be in a data center. What you're actually going to have to realize is that your future application infrastructure is going to be distributed. There's going to be some bits that are in clouds, there's going to be some bits that are in cars, there's going to be some bits that are in retail branches. And so all that we've learned before is going to be really important in our skill set for architects, for developers, for everyone. But we were talking about it. I think when you think about all those things we talked about earlier, what you're looking at is resilience is moving up into software away from hardware. That's a generic trend over the last 2 decades, I suppose, really. You talk about Adrian Cockroft's work at Netflix and others. It's all about, how do I stop building tier 4 data centers and rely on the fact that that tier 4 data center with its 2n+1 is always going to be there no matter what, and start to realize that actually I can build a more resilient system over some really low availability kit in software than I would be able to do over 2 tier 4 data centers in terms of how I do my architecture. And that's a generic trend that's driving everything around Kubernetes, around all the cross-cloud services and all the bits and pieces that we talked about, is that resilience is moving up into software. And I think that's a really interesting trend around what software defined is really all about and what cloud native is really all about. It's about that availability, that resilience moving up, so that what we've learned in that can then be extended back out again. So people go, oh, we're just doing the same as we did before. No, if I'm deploying Kubernetes containers in the back of a police car, that's very different to the dedicated hardware that I was deploying to that police car before. When we look at what we're doing in police cars, we're going from 100 kilos of kit down to about 5 kilos of kit running on a virtualized platform with failover that people can remotely update and remotely change. So it is different. I think to some people it just looks like it's still hardware in a police car, and why are you still putting hardware in a police car? It's, well, actually it's highly evolved and it's more available and it's got better services, etc., etc. My great story that I heard this week, which I love most when you talk about Starlink, is one of the things we've done in that mobile edge platform for police cars is we've got multi-link across multiple LTE. So all the police cars driving along, we're jumping across 2 or 3 LTE networks. We're maintaining high-speed connectivity all the time. And one of our customers is a race team. they go around America racing, and they go around racing in all these different locations. And they said, okay, we've got a connectivity issue. Can you provide us with the ability to, no matter whether we're using the network provided by the race series, which they turn off very quickly at the end of a race, I also still need the ability to connect to different things. And one of the people said, oh, it's fantastic, it's fine, I've solved that. We're going to put Starlink RV on top of all of our vehicles, and we don't have a problem. Until someone then pointed out that at one of the races, the paddock that they build is inside an exhibition centre with a roof. So all those vehicles are going to be parked on a roof, so your Starlink backup process isn't going to work. We need to think of something else. So there's always a scenario where whichever model you've decided to pick, someone's going to break it. And so how do we work around those? It's quite fun.
Yeah, so, and I think that's a perfect closing word. It's like you summarized almost everything we have been talking about for the last time period. Thank you for taking the time coming here.
It's been a real pleasure to come and visit Munster.
And hope we can redo that again at one point in time, either here or in the UK or somewhere else around the globe. Thank you.